Hi everyone and welcome to Snippit Sports Science. This is Chris Gavilio.
And Jared Coleman-Stark.
We now actually have a sponsor. It's eliteform.com, and Eliteform is an integrated velocity-based system using 3D camera technology with a strength planner. We've actually been able to use Eliteform in our own work environment and actually found it a really great addition to our own training. So we're really glad that they've come on board to help sponsor our podcast and help make it grow. So make sure that you go and check their system out. They actually have a free strength planner available on their website, so you can actually check out the system and how it can actually work in the first place before investing further in the system. So we thought that considering they're a velocity-based training system, that we'd actually review velocity-based training. Very fitting.
And this is the type of training that we ourselves have used quite a lot extensively, and we find it very valuable. In fact, we're probably replacing our traditional percent 1RM style of loading with more of a velocity-based intensities for our training.
So the article that we're going to review today is
Researched Applications of Velocity-Based Strength Training by Jovanović and Flanagan.
As we're all aware, when we're programming a strength program for our athletes, there's lots of different variables that have been identified and utilized for program design, such as exercise type, order, intensity or load, number of reps and sets, rest period. And as research has shown, and I'm sure as we've all known in our own craft, that being able to manipulate these variables have different outcomes on the athletes. And as we know, when we have a better relationship with an athlete, that intimate knowledge of these variables and how they work on each individual obviously helps to progress the athlete at a greater rate.
So for strength training, intensity or low has been acknowledged as being pretty much the most important stimulus for those outcomes. And what traditionally people have done is they do a 1 repetition maximum test and then use a repetition maximum continuum table to then estimate percent 1RM, how much work should someone be doing.
And as we all realise, the possible shortcoming with using 1RM testing is because we're going to a maximum with the athletes that we work with is possible injury going to a maximum. We want to ensure that with novice athletes that their technique stays together. But also, when you think about novice athletes, you tend to use rep ranges more in the general strength of, say, 10s and 12s. So when you go to take them to a 1RM, they're not used to that type of training. So you're probably not a true reflection of their absolute strength levels.
100%. And those 1 repetition maximum strength levels taken at the beginning of a mesocycle don't take into account day-to-day readiness or anything along those lines. And in my opinion, the established tables of repetition maximum continuum they're generalized tables that do not apply to your individual athletes. So for example, those have been almost entirely based off of male athletes. They don't reflect female training whatsoever. And it doesn't reflect whether an athlete is much more strength trained versus much more work capacity trained. A powerlifter, for example, will be able to do much fewer repetitions at 85% than someone who's trained more for work capacity than for absolute strength.
Correct. And also when you look at just the type of athlete, so if you have a power strength athlete, if you're doing a 1RM using a slow velocity, that may have little application to the sport that they're actually doing. So are you actually doing it in service to their training methodology by making them train heavy and slow?
Absolutely. So we think velocity-based training is a considerably superior method.
And hence the explosion of linear position transducers, wearable technology, and obviously camera systems such as Eliteform has really enabled the strength coach to be able to use movement velocity in their athletes' training environment, but also in their testing environment. Just as a basic background, a linear position transducer converts the physical attributes or the length of a measuring cable into electrical signals to yield the displacement of an object, in this case the barbell. So velocity can then be calculated from the displacement and the time, so velocity equals displacement over time, and acceleration can then be calculated from changes in velocity over time. And the ability for these devices to display live velocity-based feedback via a display screen or a secondary device has really great application for the athlete when they're training real time.
So what researchers have found is that's the mean concentric velocity that is likely most useful rather than the peak concentric velocity.
Well, this actually depends on the lift.
Absolutely.
This article talks specifically about the bench press or the squat. When you actually look at Dan Baker's work, he talks about more high velocity lifts such as jump squats and Olympic lifts and the need to actually look into peak velocity. It's important to also realize that although we're talking about average velocity here, this is for the bench press and the squat, you actually need to look at the value for the lift specific to the user.
Absolutely. For ballistic lifts, definitely that peak velocity is going to be the most important. But regardless, it's always that intention to move the load with the highest effort.
That's right. And my background used to be in throws, and we were always taught from the first day we ever lifted, whether it was 20 kilos or whether it was 200 kilos, we need to think about moving the bar with intent, how hard and how fast we want to move it. Although as a thrower, when I first started training, we actually didn't have this equipment available to us. We used simple things such as stopwatches. We used to do 3 reps bench press in under 3 seconds, using exactly the same concepts as what these linear positions transducers do, but without the technology behind it.
Right. And we've always had the coaches. A coach watches a lift and you see, well, that was a fast lift, that was a slow lift. And you kind of have a good estimation of how actually heavy or good effort it was.
And the interesting thing here is if you actually have a good experienced coach, they actually can tell you when the athlete is near max or pretty much on max. In here, they talk about, say, for example, the bench press around 0.15 to 0.2 is traditionally indicative of a 1RM or a bench. If you have a good coach who's been around lots of athletes, they'll pretty much say that was your max. And
right. I reckon a lot of coaches would actually be able to watch an athlete bench and say, that was 0.17 meters per second.
Yeah, exactly.
I reckon a lot of coaches could actually call it to the 0.1 meters per second.
So this article then goes on to talking about 3 distinct areas within the use of velocity-based training. The first one is developing a load velocity profile.
To develop the load velocity profile, the athlete completes 4 to 6 sets of different intensities ranging from 30 to 85%. When they're doing loads that would give velocities greater than a meter per second, the athlete should do 3 reps, whereas when they're doing moderate loads, where the velocity would be 0.65 to 1 meters per second, they should do 2 reps. And once they're doing heavy loads, approaching that 85% 1RM, where they'll have a velocity of less than 0.65 meters per second, they should only be doing 1 repetition.
So research has actually shown a very strong relationship between the velocity and the load, such that using a simple linear regression that yields slope and intercept of a line, you can actually look towards developing 1 RM. You can actually look to extrapolate a 1 RM if you know their minimum velocity threshold, which we'll talk about in a minute.
It's very important that the athlete maintains a maximal effort during these lifts and consistent technique, especially because often we're not doing light load lifting, and so athletes are often unaccustomed to those light loads and might alter their technique.
The advantage of using a load velocity profile, which I've actually used in my own coaching of athletes, is the ability to track an athlete's progress over time. This is of interest for me because I'm really interested in the velocity aspects of the athlete's movement. So not necessarily always focus on the maximal strength development, especially because I work with a lot of strength speed athletes in the sport of track and field, and also using submax loads. I know how taxing traditionally a 1 RM test could be. So using these submax loads, I'll have a quick snapshot of where these athletes theoretically could be in their training. The next point which the article talks about is a minimal velocity threshold, which is an important factor related into using a load velocity profile.
We found that this is the same velocity when someone is doing a 1 repetition maximum versus their last repetition on a set to failure. And in my opinion, if you think about a 1 RM, maximum 1 RM, that is the last repetition in a set to failure. So it's, it would make perfect sense.
Exactly right. And earlier I spoke about the bench press of around 0.17. In this article, they talk about 0.15 for a bench press and 0.3 for a squat.
And you look at a bunch of different articles and you see different values for those movements based on whichever different study each person has done. And I think it does depend to some extent on the individual and how trained they are in a particular thing. In my experience, I've seen the stronger the athlete, typically the more they've learned the ability to grind, and thus they can move slower at that last repetition.
Yeah, we've had lots of conversations about this. I'll tend to top out quite quickly and I won't grind, and maybe that's a result of my upbringing as an athlete. Move with intent. If you can't move it quickly, it's not worth moving.
Yep.
Whereas, say, in the powerlifting world, where they'll tend to grind the lift out because they've just got to lift a heavy load.
Exactly.
Someone who we mentioned before, Dan Baker, has done a lot of work, and we all know is very prolific in the world of velocity-based training. And he has got so many great articles in this area. If you actually want to look at other lifts and their velocity, such as he talks about jump squats using a peak velocity of 1 meter per second, bench throws at 0.89, snatch of around 1.68 to 1.98, and cleans around 1.6 meters per second. So here we're seeing a high velocity lift and obviously an increase in the velocity of the movement of the action for a 1RM. And these are really important numbers to actually realize when you're starting to train athletes, because rather than moving the bar slow, you want to teach the athlete to move with intent.
Right, and that's the difference we were talking about with the ballistic versus non-ballistic exercises. As being ballistic exercises, we're now focusing on the peak velocity for those lifts rather than the mean velocity.
Correct, yes. The third point that the article speaks about is the exertion velocity profile, where this looks at velocity as individual reps in the sets performed to failure at set percentages of 1RM, such as 60, 65, 70, 75%. So since the movement velocity threshold for a given exercise is not statistically different between 1RM and last rep, so it's 0.15 to 0.17 for a bench press, whether you're doing a 1RM or to failure on a 10 rep exercise.
The point is that the reps left in the tank is almost identically correlated across different loads with those end velocities. However many reps in reserve you have left is dictated by the velocity that you move at. As you're squatting and you have the feedback in front of you and you see your velocity steadily going down as you fatigue, you know that velocity number relates to how many reps you have in reserve. So like if I'm doing an AMRAP and I have the elite form right in front of me, and sometimes I'm like, almost at the end. And then I look at it and I see my velocity is still like 0.4. I'm like, well, you're lying to yourself. You've got more reps left. And so I keep going until I tuck under that 0.3 meters per second. And I'm like, okay, now I probably don't have any reps left.
So really, it just tells you if you need to pull your finger out.
Exactly.
Yeah, nice. Okay. I remember when I was reading this article, and I can't remember exactly which part made me think about Dan Baker speaks about the use of velocity monitoring and actual cluster sets. So let's just say, for example, you're doing a set of 8 repetitions. As we know, as we're getting reps 5, 6, 7, and 8, the velocities are getting slower and you're heading more towards, I guess, your minimum velocity threshold. In a lot of these cluster sets, what they actually did is you do a set of 4, have a rest period, another set of 4. They're actually able to maintain the velocities better in that second group of 4, so reps 5 to 8. And longitudinally, over a period of, say, 4 to 6 weeks, they actually found that their 1RM scores actually improved, which actually gets to show you that you're teaching the athlete to move with intent and you're just reinforcing that. So instead of getting to your last couple of reps and grinding, you're actually saying, well, to the athlete, no, that's actually not ideal for the muscle fiber, but rather you need to learn to push hard. And if you can't, if you're under fatigue, you need to rest, pause, and then start again when you actually are able to push with a good velocity.
Absolutely. I think that's a big difference between strength and power training versus work capacity or hypertrophy training. Is with that strength and power, you really want that maximum speed, that maximum acceleration, maximum force that you're producing on each of those lifts. Whereas with the more grindy, closer to failure sort of sets, you're producing more fatigue, which will have more of a hypertrophy stimulus. And also, as you're grinding, you have more time under tension, which is more of a hypertrophy or work capacity stimulus.
And they talk about time under tension creating almost an ischemic type condition for the muscle.
I've heard before blood flow restriction training, some people did a sort of quasi blood flow restriction training where they would try and squeeze their muscle as hard as possible because it would actually impede some of the blood flow.
And this is where actually time under tension training comes into effect, is just to be able to, on top of your concept there, is just create that ischemic condition for the muscle.
Create maximum metabolite.
And just quickly back to the cluster set concept, you're still doing the same volume. So the athlete's not actually missing out on any training, but they're actually just reinforcing the type of muscle contraction that the athlete is trying to achieve in their sporting environment.
Now, considering practical applications, there are quite a few that we can apply velocity-based training to, and those are comparing individuals using load velocity profile and monitoring changes over time.
As Jared said there, the load velocity profile gives the coaches the opportunity to track an athlete's progress over time and over across the velocity demands. And also it allows the coaches to compare athletes against each other across the velocity spectrum.
We can also estimate one repetition maximum from submaximal loads.
As I mentioned earlier, I actually use this occasionally with some athletes in their easier weeks where I want to have an element of intensity in their training, but I actually want to decrease the volume. So I want to know that although I know the athlete's at their end of their block and they have an element of fatigue, it's nice to know where they're at. It gives a purpose to the easy week, because in some older athletes, I'll actually tend to give more time off to them. So if they have one session instead of 3 sessions, what's the purpose? I think from a practical point of view, if you're giving an athlete an easy week, there still needs to be a purpose behind it. If they're heading into the gym, they know it's a restorative type week. However, if they're going to come in and lift, what are you trying to get out of that session?
One we haven't talked about as much, estimating daily readiness or daily 1 repetition maximum. As opposed to our typical 1RM testing that you could only do so often, pretty much the velocity profile establishment and creating and determining that 1 repetition maximum from your velocities is basically a good warm-up.
Yeah.
As well, you can almost do that at the beginning of every session.
Talking about readiness, we actually tried that, you and I, with our bench press.
Yes, yeah, that was good.
Yeah, and just for your listeners out there, we did our sub-maximal load velocity profiling, and mine was pretty much spot on to 0.5 kilo.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and it actually, it made you lift better as well, because you were underestimating your own 1RM, and then we go back and look at your profile, and we say, no, you can lift more today.
So to put it in perspective, at the time, I hadn't bench pressed over 175 kilos, but the equation was actually saying I should be lifting 195 kilos. I didn't know that at the time, so I actually just kept going up and I actually got 194 kilos out, which I hadn't touched that weight in probably 18 months to 2 years. So it was a real shock for me, but it actually shows that it worked, whereas, Jared, your numbers were out a little bit.
I think my estimate was a little high for what I actually got, but that was likely because I hadn't been moving heavy loads in age. I'd been doing like 5s, maybe 4s, 6s. I hadn't been doing even triples or anything. So then just the technique of going into a 1RM just wasn't as developed at the time.
And plus also, we're probably different athletes or muscle types. I'm traditionally more of quite a fast twitch fiber, whereas you come from more of a running background.
Right, originally. So next practical application is using velocity monitoring and the exertion velocity profile to control fatigue and exertion. So this is the concept that we were talking about when we were discussing that the repetitions left in the tank relates very well to the velocity that is moved. So instead of prescribing to an athlete, lift until you have 2 reps in reserve, you can prescribe lift to a particular velocity.
And this is where I actually remind myself of the Dan Baker, the cluster sets idea. So if you want to get to a certain tonnage in a session, the athlete wants to get a certain amount of work done. If you use these velocity stops as the point to say, I don't want to go any slower than this, this is where you can use the cluster concept to actually maintain the velocity.
Right. And finally, we can use the velocity to prescribe exercise load, which is sort of a overall encompassing practical application that we've discussed throughout.
So in conclusion, Jared?
I think it will absolutely replace %1RM.
Okay. I think also from just a pure literature background point of view, it's a great read. It gives you the basis behind velocity-based training, how you can use it in different aspects and different ways of thinking as a coach, how you can put it into your own practice. A lot of this stuff here, as I said, we've used for ourselves, and because we practice it quite often, we're quite comfortable with the prescribing. And as I've mentioned a few times, there's a lot of good coaches out there using that, and Dan Baker's probably quite a prolific S&C coach who uses this quite well and actually presents it. So if you actually get an opportunity to ever listen to him talk about it, definitely something worthwhile doing.
Absolutely. I think it's also just a better way to teach people how to lift in general by prescribing that velocity. Because I don't think I really understood how to lift with maximal effort until we started velocity-based training. And I saw the numbers that I was actually producing. And
also being able to educate your athletes as well on what the numbers mean. When you coach them quite well, when they actually leave your facility, so let's just say you have an athlete who's might be traveling overseas for an international competition and you want to have an element of intensity in their taper, but you don't want the volume. If you can actually start to use the velocity rather than a percentage RM, and you're ensuring that there's not too much fatigue going into the system leading into their major competition.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you very much. And once again, thanks to eliteform.com for coming on as one of our sponsors. So please make sure you give them a visit on their website or visit them on social media. And if you'd like any more information, visit our website or on our own Instagram at @SnippitScience. Thanks for listening.
Bye.